A few days ago, John came out with a video titled, What is a Recession? And he defined for us a little bit about what recessions are. And simply put, they're just 2 quarters back to back of negative GDP growth. And if you're like many of us, you may be wondering, why are we talking about this? We just had a recession in 2020. We shouldn't have one yet. The economy's reopening, it's growing. What's going on? And the answer to that lies in two of the things that John talked about in his video. And the two things are one, GDP, and two, the yield curve. And we could sit here and have an hour long discussion on all of this and what it means. But one of the reasons why we're bringing this up is in the first quarter of 2022, the economy actually contracted a little bit in real terms. And what does that mean? GDP came in at negative 1.4%. So, from that aspect, we only need one more quarter of negative GDP growth to have a recession. And that does not necessarily mean we're having a 2008 style recession. We could just have an academic recession. And sometimes that occurs. And the reason why it might occur again lies in how the calculation is done. So GDP is simply consumer spending plus the government spending plus business investment plus our net exports. And when we dig into those numbers, net exports is almost always negative. And right now, we're in an environment where it could be more deeply negative than normal. When we think about that, that should make a little bit of sense because the United States, in its economic recovery and reopening, is well ahead of most of the world. We see that there's a little bit of a recession going on in Europe right now, and a lot of other countries are still struggling with COVID. That's not the same case in the US. So it should make sense that we are buying more goods from the rest of the world than the world is able to buy from us. So that number is probably going to stay negative. The other issue that we have is the business investment piece, and that really centers more around inventories. So best way to think about this is if you try and go buy a car right now, you may have only 3 or 4 cars on the lots to choose from because we can't get them from other countries at the moment, and it's hard to import them. So those are some issues that are pulling down the GDP numbers, and they could remain volatile the remaining year. If you add that to inflation, it's entirely possible that we could see an academic recession in the second quarter, even with a strong consumer and not a recessionary environment that we think back to like 2008. It may not actually even be felt by a lot of us, but it's entirely possible that it occurs. The second thing that we wanted to bring up was the yield curve, and not going too deeply into that, but essentially for a very short amount of time, hours, even just a couple business days, the yield curve did invert, meaning short-term rates were higher than long-term rates. And generally that's a precursor to a recession. But it's also kind of like telling us something that we already knew. As soon as the economy enters into an expansion, we know that at some point it's going to go into a recession and contract. It's kind of like going out into your car, turning it on to drive somewhere, and then telling someone, well, I have to turn my car off at some point. We already know this is going to happen. So these two things together bring up a conversation about recession. It's not something that we should be concerned about necessarily. We're not seeing a drop off of demand or consumer spending, but it is possible that we could see a recession in 2022, academically speaking. We're going to talk a little bit more about it in our next video and a Q&A between John and I on what the implications are and what you should do, if anything, if a recession occurs.